Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's meeting of Scrutiny Review Panel 3, which this year is looking into the COVID-19 inequalities and recovery. My name's Councillor Faye Block, and I'll be chairing tonight's meeting, where the substantive item is looking at the impact of COVID-19 on schools and educational settings. I'll start off with Item 1 of the agenda, which is apologies for absences or any substitutions. Harjeet, have we had any apologies? No, I'll take that as a no. Thank you. Are there any urgent matters? I haven't had anything, so we'll go on to item 3, matters to be considered in private where there is none. And finally, I'd like to ask members if they have any declarations of interest. No, great. So if we go on to item 5, which is the minutes of the last meeting, are there any comments, or are we all agreed on those minutes?
Agreed.
Thank you, Councillor Kumar. Great. So in that case, I will move on to item 6, which is looking at the impact on schools and educational settings of COVID-19. And I'll pass over to Julie Lewis, who will introduce this part.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor, and good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. So we thought we would hopefully do a little bit of a summary of the report at the beginning, and then I'd like to involve 3 of my officers who are very much at the forefront of working with schools on tackling some of the particular areas of inequality that have been exacerbated as a result of the pandemic. So really, I hope you've had a chance to read the report, and I think it's worth me sort of pointing out at the start that prior to the start of the pandemic, back in 2019, Ealing schools had made tremendous progress in reducing and closing the gaps between our most disadvantaged children and their peers, in striking contrast to the gaps nationally and in London. And it's notable that in 2019, Ealing secondary schools were ranked first place across the whole of the country for the amount of progress that children make between their arriving in secondary school and at the end of the statutory year 11. And our primary schools too had made huge strides in closing those gaps for our disadvantaged learners. So we were on a real crest of a wave really in 2019. And it's also true to say that, despite all of that, that picture of overall achievement, there were back in 2019 some groups within Ealing for whom achievement and patterns of underachievement had remained a bit of a challenge for us and for schools. And so what's happened over the course of the last 18 months, 2 years, inevitably is the likelihood that those challenges have increased. And that's why we're going to focus a little bit later on our Black Caribbean children. But going back to the report, it's worth stating that prior to the pandemic, 17% of our children were living in the 20% most income deprived areas. And we know that over the course of the pandemic, the number of children eligible for free school meals increased by over 3%. So you're looking around about 10,500 children living in quite significant poverty. We know that the impact of the pandemic has also exacerbated pre-existing health inequalities, and that's seen in the rising obesity rates of our reception age children as they're coming into our schools. And we've also talked in previous panels about the prevalence of mental health problems in our worst hit communities. Through all of our previous discourse at the closure of schools in March 2020 and the period of disruption to learning was widespread and significant, and reached a peak really in that period between October 2020 and December 2020, when reported cases reached a peak in Ealing, and multiple classes and bubbles were forced to self-isolate, and many schools struggled to stay open. And we know as well that in the early months of the pandemic, schools really were not well equipped to mobilize remote learning for children, and many schools were really quite slow in organizing themselves to be able to do that effectively, and the barriers to that have obviously been well reported. And most significantly, you know, towards the second phase of the pandemic, when things had significantly improved, despite everything and despite all of the efforts of many pupils still faced barriers in terms of basic access to the internet and to devices. So that sort of digital divide, as it's been called, the effects of that will remain for some time. We've also talked about the sectors of our society most impacted by the pandemic, those with learning disabilities, individuals from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, and those living in areas of high economic disadvantage. And coupled with the impacts of unemployment and crowded housing, and high numbers of mental health referrals, all of that has created the circumstances that have made it very difficult for some children and some families to recover. I think it's also worth saying that, you know, the young people that have particularly struggled are those young people that perhaps wouldn't have gone on to study level 3 courses in schools, that would have gone on to vocational courses at college, and who've missed out on, you know, 2 years of vocational or employment focused learning, and that, coupled with the impact on the employment sector not being able to offer the same routes into supported employment, has really affected that group of young people. So I did want to end on a bit of a positive note in saying that, you know, that we can conclude early on that the long-term effects are going to continue for some time. But I think what we've also seen in the last 18 months, really quite unprecedented levels of collaboration and cooperation between schools. And we were delighted. We did a big survey in July to look at the impact of the Ealing Learning Partnership over the course of the year. And about 63 schools responded to that survey with very detailed feedback. And the response was overwhelmingly positive. And later on, Madhu will talk about some of the positive spin-offs that have come out of our work with schools. But schools did report the value that they placed on the strength of communication, the join up between services, really strong and clear communication through our Ealing Grid for Learning, strong support for governors. Our support for governors continued right through, and we've also been able to maintain a high profile of networks and support meetings for schools. So a real sense of cohesion and the quality of safeguarding advice and guidance for schools has also been commented on as a huge strength. So we're very pleased with that feedback. So what we thought we would do now is just make sure that councillors were aware of the sort of structure of the partnership, how it works, and then I'm going to ask my colleagues to sort of shine a light on some of the work that we're doing to really facilitate and support schools in driving that recovery, which we see as you know, both a short-term plan, but a much longer-term plan as well. So if I could ask Madhu to flick the slides up. Thanks, Madhu. So if you just want to flick through them as I speak, that's great. So the Ealing Learning Partnership, for those of you that are not familiar with it, was set up it's actually just about to go into its 4th year. So it's actually become quite well established now. We're just entering our sort of second big phase of development. It's a partnership to set up to promote educational excellence and well-being, and it's designed through a collaboration between 85 schools and the council, and schools subscribe to the partnership and play an active and sustained role in its development. So we go on to the next one, and I'm just going to canter through this because I think many of you will be familiar, but at its heart, the partnership's designed to cultivate and really release the capacity that exists within our schools for the benefit of children. And the strapline, no learner left behind and no school left behind, it drives every single piece of activity that comes out of the partnership. And at its heart, we want to make sure that the partnership becomes a magnet for attracting and developing and retaining talent in our schools, because without a high quality workforce and without high quality leadership, we know that we can't realise any of these ambitions for children. So we don't work exclusively, of course, with schools. I mean, there are other education partnerships across the country that have spun away and outside of the council, but our partnership firmly rooted in the council, and every single committee linked across with partners in children and families and with our preventative and safeguarding teams, so that we've got a strong wraparound offer for schools. And I put in bold just there the two ways in which we've strengthened our mission statement for the next 2 years, which is to respond directly to the short and longer term consequences of the pandemic, and also to play a really key and active role in driving our race equality work and responding to the Race Equality Commission when it's published in November. And we'll come to that a little bit later. So if we just flick to the next picture, because it's probably the clearest and simplest representation of the partnership. So we have the board in the middle, and the board comprises of 9 school leaders, governors, and 4 senior officers. And the board is the strategic overseer of the partnership's work, and obviously makes decisions on how resources are spent. And the work is driven through the structure of these 6 domains and committees, and each committee is co-led with the school and comprises both school members and officers. And those are the 6 domains, and they've been in place since 2018, and all our work is driven through that. So developing great teachers, inspiring great learners, and securing strong leadership. A big focus on SEN and inclusion, because we know that if we don't get consistency across schools, that that we've got an uneven playing field, and that's what we want to be doing. And then a big focus on safeguarding and well-being, and that's very much about developing the resilience of children and young people, but also the capacity of schools. And Karen talked in the previous scrutiny about all of the work that's been going on to support universal mental health and well-being provision in schools, and that work is also driven through the partnership. And then progression and pathways, making sure that every young person is on a pathway to sustainable employment wherever that is possible, and that includes our learners with SEN. Recruitment and retention, which we've touched on, and supporting schools to spend well for less. So really trying to drive economies of scale through collective procurement projects to help schools utilise money as best they can. And then if you go to the next slide, and then that partnership then works alongside and through and with all of these other statutory and preventative services that sit within children, adults, and public health, and that's how we work. So we're going to whiz now onto the report, and I'm just going to touch on attendance and workforce, because ultimately we want all children in school, and we want the best possible workforce, and that's the starting point really for all of our work. And we know that attendance crashed through the pandemic, and with some quite difficult decisions for families about which children could access on-site provision, very difficult decisions for schools where key worker attendance started to rocket in the second phase, and schools struggling to provide both online learning for children at home and also meet the needs of vulnerable children who were entitled to be catered for on site. So an enormous kind of ups and downs of and I don't think any child had a good experience through that period. Although I have to say that schools did a most fantastic job in securing the attendance of children with education, health and care plans, and that's one of the big successes of the last 18 months, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We saw huge variations across geographical areas. In some cases in central Ealing, schools on-site staffing just simply not being able to cope with the numbers of children that were turning up to school during periods of lockdown, and at the other end, and particularly in Southall, not being able to get those children into school who should really have been in school and would have been a lot safer and better catered for in school, and similarly across parts of Northolt and East Acton as well. And then we also saw this massive increase in the number of children whose parents registered them for elective home education, a 78% increase. It's absolutely huge, and it's mirrored across London. That hasn't gone back down yet, although there's a lot of work being done at the moment on making sure that those children are getting the kind of curriculum entitlement that they should be getting, and tackling some of the providers that have popped up offering education services, and obviously one of our roles is to make sure that those providers are legitimate and are safe, properly safeguarding children. Big number of missing education, children missing education referrals, and a whole number of children kind of stuck overseas for whatever reason. But I'm pleased to say that number, and the number reported in the report, has significantly gone down now. We've only got a small handful of children now who remain overseas. So a lot of work by the school attendance team in targeting particular groups, big equalities focus, and getting the children into school. So we go on to the next slide, and this is where I'm going to stop in a second. It's almost impossible to describe the kind of chaos that ensued in terms of the school workforce since March 2020. Late announcements, changing advice and guidance put head teachers in a very, very difficult position, and many feeling that they were effectively making decisions that would ultimately possibly affect people's lives. And I think never before have head teachers had to manage that complexity of personal risk and organizational risk, and that led to very, very high levels of stress and anxiety. If you were to ask me 18 months ago how many of our head teachers would still be in post, I would have had a fairly gloomy picture to tell you back then. But actually what's really striking is they're still all in post. They still absolutely determined to kind of get through this and do the very best they could for their children. And you'll know of all sorts of reports of head teachers doing door-to-door food deliveries and all sorts of things, way outside of their kind of job description. So, over 2,200 COVID cases confirmed, and that number obviously has risen since the summer, and we still have a small handful of schools where there are a number of staff still impacted by COVID. And we still have schools with unvaccinated staff as well, and that continues to present challenges. The good news is that Ealing heads did feel very well supported through all of that. And what we managed to do as well is work with governors and work with schools to support recruitment in some of the most pressing circumstances. So overall, the picture of the workforce, despite everything, is a relatively resilient and buoyant picture. So I'm going to pause there, and I don't know whether people want to sort of ask questions at this point, or whether you'd like us to carry on. Was going to hand over to Madhu, whether you'd like us to carry on and then sort of ask questions at the end.
Are there any questions from members at this point? If you could put your hands up. Oh yes, Mr. Bazran has a question, so over to you.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, Julie. It was a really informative presentation. My question is that about supplementary schools. There are quite a few sort of voluntary organisations who were providing supplementary schooling for children, particularly primary school children around Ealing, and that often sort of, as the name suggests, supplements the schooling and teaching at the formal schools. Those were also closed for much of the year. What do we know if there's any impact, any sort of double impact of that, as it were, upon those children who would have been attendees from some of these supplementary school settings?
Yes, I mean, for sure there will have been. A number of supplementary schools did switch to their own online provisions, so some were able to adapt. We've seen those providers gradually reopen, which is great. But yes, certainly, those providers offering really sort of rich on-site provision was certainly impacted in exactly the same way.
Thank
you. Are there any more questions? Yes, Councillor Kumar.
Yes, I was actually going to wait, but I think I might as well ask the question now. The referrals, the children's referrals gone up by 38%. Could you just expand that on a little bit? I know we touched base on quite a bit of the what you've said at the pre-agenda, but I'd like to hear a little bit more on that, and also the obviously the teachers that have concerns or have not been able to attend school due to personal reasons or are unwell, and the agency staff aspect that I had raised. I mean, is that still continuing? Is it higher or is it lower?
Okay, thank you.
And last, sorry, is the school governors. I know I touched base on that previously, but are the school governors, because the whole situation has changed, is quite challenging for them. Are they being given a special training on all the issues that you have actually raised? And I think, Madhu, you will probably have a response to that, because I remember raising that, but I'll leave it to you to respond as you feel fit.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, the number of referrals, children missing education. So this was over the course of the pandemic, where we simply schools reported that they weren't able to track individual children, and that obviously there was a whole raft of reasons why that was. We had a number of children go overseas, and it wasn't clear in many cases where they were. who they were residing with, and what the plans were for their return. So there was quite a lot of activity in sort of tracking the movements of those children during that time. But I pulled this together over the summer. I haven't got the most recent figures, but I can certainly get those to you and give you a bit more analysis on that. And then yes, there do remain a very small number of clinically very vulnerable teachers or teachers with immunity issues and other chronic illnesses who are understandably anxious about being in close proximity with teachers who are not vaccinated. So that does bring about a number of challenges for schools, and you know, that situation is unlikely to be resolved for some time. It's something that leaders are having to work with at the moment. And the school governor training, yeah, I mean, the quality of governor training that was provided online throughout the pandemic was very well received. A whole program put together by Therese McNulty, and I think we're fairly confident that governors did receive very high quality information and guidance throughout the pandemic, and was supported with managing you know, virtual governing body meetings, etc. So yes, we're pretty confident actually about that, but always happy to take more feedback.
Thank you. Any more questions from members? I'm not seeing any hands up. Julie, I just wanted to ask about support for heads and teachers and staff. You know, you discussed how heads were overwhelmed, and I think that they really acted as a safety net for the community beyond just education of the kids. You know, I felt that in my own experience, we were having calls to check in on the whole family rather than just even the children. And of course, then, you know, ongoing in the pandemic, difficult staff and leaders. And now that we're going back, it's about trying to fill in those gaps. I think it's not just educational, we're probably looking at behavioural issues as well that may have cropped up, and the well-being of children affected by it. But just what we're not seeing an increase in funding for CAMS from my as far as I'm concerned. So a lot of that work then is falling on schools as well, and it's a lot after a year and a half of the pandemic, and then continuing. We're looking at teachers trying to fit in 2 years, year and a half of missing education. What are we doing as a council to help provide support for?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a really important question. We are lucky to be in partnership with the Mental Health in Schools Universal Programme. So there's a huge programme of work on supporting that, what you might call the sort of lower level mental health referrals. We've got currently 32 schools in that programme, and the team is also working on a staff wellbeing charter, which we want to develop with our schools over the next year, because I mean, there's a direct correlation between you know, the confidence and resilience of particularly dedicated safeguarding leads and their ability to work effectively with children. So we are investing, in fact we met this morning, we are investing in a programme of support, particularly for designated safeguarding leads, because their work has probably quadrupled, and in fact many schools, particularly large secondary schools, have now got up to 5, 6 designated safeguarding leads. So you can see that there's been a quite a change in resourcing in schools. So much more investment in those kind of what you might call sort of frontline pastoral and mental health work with students. So it is absolutely high on our agenda, and we're lucky in that we've got a fantastic team working also on personal social development curriculum in schools. We've just appointed an officer there as well. So, you know, it's very much on our agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. If you can continue. Oh, Councillor Malcolm, you've got your hands up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the question I've got relates to remote learning, and paragraph, I think 1.7 sort of refers to that, and earlier it was mentioned. When I've asked about this question before, it's always been a slight grey area as to who's responsible for making sure our children are able to take part in remote learning to a reasonable level, so that they don't fall back as much as they might. And how much of that was down to the government in terms of a lack of funding or a lack of an infrastructure, and how much was down to schools or the council not maybe being efficient at certain factors at the beginning, which obviously is very difficult when no one knew there was going to be a pandemic. When I look at what's happening now, there is still lots of gaps there totally. You know, who is ultimately responsible for this, and what has the council or schools not done that they could have done earlier, perhaps?
Okay, well that's a very big question. I suppose I'd want to reflect back that different barriers for different schools. So, for example, right at the very beginning, some of the barriers were to do with infrastructure in schools. So, you know, larger schools, and particularly secondary schools, could respond relatively quickly, although it was imagine a massive learning curve to go from, you know, on Monday delivering face-to-face curriculum to you know, literally within the space of a couple of weeks, you know, being expected to develop some kind of, I mean, that's a huge and unexpected ask of any establishment. And, you know, some of our primary schools just simply didn't have the basic IT infrastructure to even get going. So there were issues to do with infrastructure. There were issues for all schools to do with staff training, and there were issues to do with children's ability to respond to it. So, I mean, you could have the most amazing digital offer to roll out to your children, but if you're in a house of, you know, you've got four brothers and sisters, you're sharing, you know, one device, and you've got limited access to the internet. It's pointless, you know. So the barriers to it being a solution were multiple and highly complex. The government, the DFE, if you remember, brought in I can't remember the word that they used, but basically a compulsory order that all schools had to provide an online offer. This was in the sort of second period of the lockdown, and that really intensified efforts. And what we were able to do then, I think, is very quickly mobilize what was going on with our sort of pioneer schools and our trailblazer schools, and mobilize that for the benefit of others, coupled with obviously a lot of donations of laptops. But the supply of laptops was problematic, and that was a central supply issue. That wasn't a local issue. So, I mean, it's, you know, I could write a whole paper just on this one area. I don't think anybody's to blame particularly. I think that you know, there are the private sector, there are other places in Europe and who education systems that have invested more thoroughly in a remote learning offer earlier on, and it's just not something that the state sector had invested in this circumstance, and for so many children, and in such chaotic circumstances. So I think, you know, I think a huge amount of learnings come out of it. I think, you know, on a positive note, I think that some of the technologies that were developed and some of the uses of technology will remain and will be used highly effectively in the next era. So yeah, I'll stop there. it's a huge area.
Thank you. Dr. Marion, sorry, I can't see your surname there. Oh, is it? Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Would you come in?
This is really a comment rather than a question, in that through my work with SACRE, I've been involved with several of the primary schools over this COVID period, in particular to do with collective worship and reflection in schools. And I have to say, apart from all the learning that's gone on, that sort of support of meditative reflection has been available for children, and it's been organised in such a way that siblings of different ages can take part. And I think it has been absolutely admirable what the primary schools have done in that regard. I just wanted to let you know about that.
Thank you. That's really nice. Thank you.
Councillor Byrne.
Thank you. I'd just like to pick up the point that Councillor Malcolm's just highlighted. And I think it is an issue of actually infrastructure rather than the mission. And I think, that's something that, something like at least 10% of children across the borough didn't have access to the internet. And I think, this is where the provision of, free, cheap or even cheap internet access is a vital element of education, work, and everything else, and utilities. And I'm not ashamed in any way, shape, or form to say that one of the greatest policy offerings from 2019 by the Labour Party was the opportunity to have free broadband. But it would be worth actually considering as a recommendation from this scrutiny panel to think about, could we as a council seriously think about, can we provide some sort of provision of a broadband, cooperative broadband or something like that? We did look into cooperatives a few years ago. So why don't, we think about recommending that the council look at what the potential is for having a broadband cooperative being a source of provision across the borough.
Thank you. Yeah, on that point, I have to say at my college where I work, dongles were provided for students who didn't have internet access. So there are ways that we can try to look at filling that gap in the future. One of the things that I think also with the home learning remote that isn't really discussed a lot is for young children. If your parents are working and can't sit there and help you, the idea that a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old can sit there on Teams or Zoom and be accessing all this work remotely without an adult sitting there explain, it was, with my the older two I found could access it, understand it. My youngest, I was working, I couldn't sit with her, and you're just like, it's,
yeah, that's
I genuinely don't think she learned anything in that time, but everybody was trying their best, and that's what we were all doing, but we were in kind of survival mode, weren't we? But there is right. And I think with the younger kids, it really is about them getting back in and filling the gaps rather than that provision is accessible and effective for that age group.
Yeah, teaching's all about being face to face, isn't it, and interacting, and it's a social activity. So I was lucky enough to be invited to a whole morning of remote lessons and to sit in and live remote lessons, and I was exhausted by the end of it, and the children were completely exhausted, and the teachers were in bits. It's certainly not any kind of reality that we would ever want to repeat. So thank you.
Can I ask you to continue with the
yes, of course. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Madhu, and Madhu, I think probably will shine a bit of a light on some of the things we're doing to stimulate recovery. Over to you, Madhu.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Hopefully, I think you can see that. Okay, so you've all had a chance to read the report, so I'm not going to really sort of pick apart bits of the report, but I'm actually going to talk about what we've done since then and what we're doing. So thinking about the emerging priorities that are in the report, and really share with you the ELP actions and activity that's in place to address these priorities. So I'll touch on early year settings, primary and secondary schools, SEN and inclusion, and then we want to draw your attention to some of the work we're doing with vulnerable groups. And Samira will talk to you about the No Learner Left Behind project and our race equity work. And Sarah will talk to you about the Southall Resilience project. Okay, so just sort of starting off really with the overarching challenges. Some of these things were touched upon in the report, but so challenges from before and where we are now really. So there has been an increase in children with additional needs. So that's children who have complex needs, children that are requiring educational healthcare plans, but also children who have been newly identified as having special needs. As we all know, there's been a lot of loss of learning time, but that's not just academic, that's also the children haven't had as many opportunities or experiences as they would have done if they had attended school, and obviously that has an impact. You know, we're worried about the children's emotional and mental health. Assessment is a big one, as you all know. Testing, you know, just stopped, it didn't happen, and so schools are having to think about reviewing how they carry out assessment, thinking about how they are going to assess the children and what they're going to assess as well. So what are they expecting the children to be able to do at this point? What does baseline look like? What's a fair and accurate assessment of those children? But with that sits the pressure to close the gap. And as was mentioned earlier, it's kind of trying to get that balance between making sure the children make good academic progress, but also ensuring pupil well-being. And schools are really working hard to try and get that balance there. Some of the children have found it quite difficult to adapt to being in school full time, because obviously they've spent a lot of time at home with their families or just in a different environment. Not with that sort of 9 to 3:30 as they do now. So that's not just, again, academically, it's, you know, making friends, turn taking, sharing. So they're all the activities that schools are trying to kind of ensure they're providing experiences for the children. And also physically, because, you know, children getting quite tired quite quickly because they haven't been as physical. So all of these things are having, you know, do have an impact on the child's experience, but it will, you know, improve over time. Schools and settings have noticed that actually they're having to adapt their policies to meet the needs of the children, because behaviour has changed for some of our children, as I mentioned, with assessment and marking, etc. So that's a bit of a challenge for schools at the moment, because they're having to review a few of their policies. COVID rules, we've touched on that already. But, you know, I think head teachers and senior leaders, again, struggling with sort of keeping up to date with the COVID rules, as we all are, but also as they've become more relaxed, which is great, it's also making sure, though, that the staff and families and parents feel safe within the relaxed rules. And, you know, just to bear in mind that children are still being sent home, you know, and obviously staff are still being sent home, which is then creating a strain on staffing and the capacity in schools and settings. And finally, there schools are reporting that obviously parents' mental health and well-being is a concern from them, and they're trying to really think about how they can support their parents. But before I go on to the priorities and actions, I do want to share some of the successes and celebrations. I think that's really important. Again, lots of these have been touched on actually, but the attendance for our vulnerable children, so children with plans, you know, schools were really sort of driven to ensure that children with plans did attend school, and children with special needs, you know, they were really on the case with parents and encouraging them to come in, and actually the attendance of vulnerable children did really improve. The quality of remote education, yes, it went on a bit of a journey, but it actually, in the end, that the quality was really quite strong. And when we think about remote education, it's not just what's online and virtually, it's about the whole package. So lots of schools were providing practical resources, paper-based activities, sending books home, making sure that children had access to cubes and Numicon and all those sorts of things. And also there was quite a lot of work around one-to-one or small group work, or children getting some input from the class teacher, but then as they would in the classroom, having some additional support from teaching assistants as well. And that was done online, sometimes over the phone. So there's quite a lot of sort of different things that schools did really to make sure that children were able to access the curriculum. We provided quite a lot of guidance quite early on. We created an audit tool around remote education that sort of touched on the fact that it's not sitting in front of a computer from 9 o'clock till 3 o'clock, and all the things that schools needed to consider to make sure that all children's needs were met. I also met with Ealing Parent Carer Forum to ask them what the experience was like for parents, particularly if they had children with additional needs, and then put a sort of bit of guidance together really for schools. This is what the parents are thinking, so they were able to sort of modify their approaches. We saw some really good, strong safeguarding practices that have continued. Some wonderful things really. Schools having a remote worry box, so children were able to go into the school website and click onto the worry box if they wanted to speak to their class teachers, things like that, which I just think was just fantastic, really. Schools have reported that they've deepened their understanding of their communities, they've got better relationships with their families, and actually they're having they were able to kind of build relationships with families that we'd considered to be hard to reach. Actually, those relationships have really changed, which is brilliant. Staff resilience and their commitment actually to the children and to the families over this time. The children's ability to adapt to the change, because they had to deal with a lot of change there. Lots of schools have been sort of adapted the school day, thinking about extra breaks in the day, thinking about, as it's mentioned before, having moments of reflection, having opportunities to kind of come together in virtual assemblies, and then also making sure that the curriculum was meeting the children's needs. So it wasn't all English, English, maths, phonics, etc. There was opportunity for more circle time, for more PSHE, arts, etc. And I think just to say there that in terms of help and the help that we've provided and the response to need, I think we did react quite quickly. And I think that is something to celebrate, that we were there to support schools during this time. Okay, so this takes me on to the early years setting. And they mentioned that they had 4 priorities that they're worried about. So priority 1 was that increase the uptake of nursery places, in particular 2-year-olds. So from at this point, daily attendance of children in nursery provision remains above 90%, which is great. And actually the number of vulnerable 2-year-olds in provision is steadily increasing. At the moment, it's at 60%. So we're pleased with that, and we're hoping that will continue to increase. Priority 2 was to ensure support for children with SEND at all stages. So there's a range of training that's been put on for early years providers, including SEND leadership. This one's very important, how and when to apply for an education healthcare plan. So this is to ensure that children are being identified at the earliest possible stage, and then the journey towards them receiving the support happens as early as it can. Training on language development for children under 5, because obviously we know that children haven't been in school and haven't been exposed perhaps to so much the richness of language, so that training is there for earliest providers. There's a few other bits I won't read it all out to you actually because I'm aware of time, but children's centres they are running talk and play sessions and fun and learn sessions for children with additional needs and their families as well. We're also doing some partnership work with the DFE on the Early Years Professional Development Programme, which is an online training programme. Actually, it's 10 hours of online training, and the DFE are paying for staff cover costs and providing some mentoring. And then the Early Years team are supporting providers to embed the early years reforms, and the Early Years conference in January will focus on race equity. The last one there is around support for parents. So children's centres have returned to face-to-face sessions, and they've increased the range of courses on offer. And the early start health teams are working with vulnerable families, identifying their needs, and so signposting and offering support. I'll move on to primary years here now. So four priorities. The first three sort of linked together. So that was around the lost learning resulting in lower pupil attainment and progress than would be normally expected, the wider learning gaps between pupils depending on how much of their education has been disrupted, and the quality and experience of home learning that, again, you've mentioned, and the lack of exposure to a full breadth of curriculum. So some actions, we have re-established peer reviews. Obviously, they couldn't take place when we were in lockdown, but we re-established them, and that's working through school clusters. We're providing more opportunity for sharing effective strategies and models through our networks. Cluster leads are identifying successful practice and then making links between schools. So if a school's struggling with a particular area, they'll be able to signpost them to schools where they've got successful practice and they'll be able to support each other. We're providing training for teachers on assessment for learning. So that is being able to assess in the moment and then adapting the teaching and in that moment, really, as the lesson is going. We're continuing to develop the partnership between the Learning and Achievement and SEN and Inclusion committees. We're promoting all our key messages through quadrant meetings, and we're also supporting schools to develop their curriculum through improved contact with subject hubs. We're providing training for middle leaders, and we're establishing networks for science, maths, English and RE. And the fourth priority there was in terms of children's emotional resilience after the lengthy time away from school. I'm not going to talk too much about this because I know at Scrutiny Panel 2 it was all covered. But as Julie mentioned, the mental health team have got a really good package of support, regular newsletters, and that's for children, families, but also staff. The mental health toolkit rollout, and we're also exploring some work around trauma-informed approaches, and we're starting a project on that with some schools in the near future. Okay, and now looking at secondary. So 3 priorities from secondary that's in your report: support schools in driving recovery and closing gaps between groups of learners. So again, we're working on identifying common priorities for schools through the established networks. We're providing opportunities for school leaders to share effective practice, and we're building links between primary and secondary curriculum leads so that they can work together to support subject knowledge and progression in the foundation subjects. We want to retain a concentrated focus on our Black, Caribbean and other underachieving groups. And so we want to engage more schools in the programme, but also in the action research arising from the No Learner Left Behind programme, which Samira will explain what it is in a little while. And then we're also quite worried about the impact on children whose exams were disrupted and then as a result haven't taken up college places, because college place uptake is quite low. So it's a standing focus item for our careers leaders networks and our post-16 leaders networks. And a new employer hub has been set up for post-16 students with special educational needs, and we're working with Spring Hello, a special school, on that. And then with children with SEND, so we've got 5 priorities here. So the first one there was around improving quality first teaching and supporting schools to explore alternative models so that they're able to support a broader range of need and obviously the increase in children with SEND. So we are, I'm actually training class teachers on improving inclusive practice. Cohorts 2, we've had cohort 1, cohort 2 begins tomorrow actually, and we've got 17 teachers on that. And the idea is with this project is that I do the training with the teachers, class teachers, to develop their confidence and knowledge, but then they work with the SENCO and then share that in their schools. So, you know, that the training and the learning is spreading within their schools. I'm creating a working party with a group of SENCOs actually, where we're going to try and devise a framework, a guidance framework to help schools to kind of consider alternative models and alternative approaches in meeting children's needs. We've increased our training offer for class teachers and teaching assistants, and we're launching the Autism Champions project next week. Actually, we launched that. Developing support for school leadership of SEND. So school leadership of SEND is not just the SENCO, so it's not just the SEND coordinator. It's thinking about the deputy head, the head teachers, assistant head teachers, and looking at the governors. So we've got a really good governance training package in place. And actually, just to touch on the point raised earlier, is that during lockdown, we did put guidance out for governors. So sort of the questions they'd want to ask their SENCOs and ask their DSLs, what sort of things they should be looking for, what evidence they should be gathering. And we also put together a reporting format for schools so that those so the conversation was sort of seamless really between the governors and the schools. So we put that guidance in place during lockdown, and if we're continuing to use that model. We also run joint governor training with SENCOs, and we're also running one with DSL, so that a governor and the leader in school together. So that's having a really good impact. They're hearing the same messages, and then they're also able to have that conversation. We have recruited 6 lead SENCOs in primary. They will be leading sort of their cluster of schools, providing mentoring, providing support for SENCOs, and also training. Our SENCO networks have been really well attended, and we've got a drive to improve our communication between the local authority and schools around SEN and inclusion. So we've set up a fortnightly bulletin that goes out to schools. We're also doing, I say, lots of work with deputy heads and SENCOs together, really spending time reflecting and evaluating practice in the schools, and we're using nascent or national good practice audit tools to support that work. SEN is a standing agenda item at head teacher briefings, and we've got a really dynamic committee in place now actually that really drive and champion the experience our children with SEN that they're having in our schools. Training for early years practitioners, I won't talk about it too much actually because I have covered it already with the early years, but one thing I do want to share, because it's just sort of just got confirmation this last week, we've received a little bit of funding that I'm going to use, we are using, to get 2 experienced inclusion practitioners from the early years to work with teachers and teaching assistants in mainstream early years, and they'll be helping them with real practical strategies and really thinking about the universal teaching model in the classroom. So yeah, something very exciting, a sort of a slightly different approach, and I'm looking forward to seeing the impact of that. We've got improving transition systems and processes between settings and schools for children with plans and special needs. It was really important over the last 2 years, but continues to be a priority for us. So we produced transition guidance actually, not last year, the year before. So we want to work on refreshing that now that obviously children are back and it looks different. We've actually, for the first time ever, we're having SCAN leads and lead SENCOs in a room together, actually having these conversations around the systems and processes and what needs to change and what needs to develop. So I think we'll see some really good impact from those open and transparent conversations. I worked with London Grid for Learning to produce an electronic transfer of information form. So it's about sort of spreading that out more widely now to support that discussion between primary and secondary. We're setting up a primary and secondary working party so that, again, as I said, so we can really have those discussions and unpick the barriers and challenges there. And also working with the early years team to build relationships and systems between nurseries and schools. And then finally, our last one there is continue to develop effective working relationships with parents, because your parents are key. So I regularly meet with the Ealing Parent Carer Forum, so we continue to do that. I'm working with the Ealing Parent Carer Forum to try and have one volunteer parent, like a link parent in every school. That's our aim. We're starting off a small pilot, and the aim is over the next 2 years is that we have a link volunteer parent in every school, and they'll be able to support parents on their, if they've got children with additional needs, on their journey, really signposting to support and advice. We're developing a SEN Family and Schools Partnership Award. So we're just in the pilot stages of that. we are offering information sessions for SENCOs, but actually for administrators in schools on services and support that's available for parents, because actually Ealing does offer a lot, but sometimes people just don't know about it. So working with the office staff really, so they're on hand, because often it's the parent that goes into the office and might express a concern and they don't know where to signpost. So we're working with them to help them to know what's out there. But also we've produced a really good information leaflet that we're hoping we'll be able to put into GPs practices, so that we're sort of getting it to parents from different places really. And then finally continue to develop our relationship and partnership with the local offer team, so that we are developing that local offer page so that it's accessible to our parents. Okay, before I go on, I'm going to stop for a moment. I know that was a lot of information there. If anyone's got any questions or reflections, anything they want to share before we move on to Samira and Sarah.
Got Mr. Bertharan, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thanks, Madhu. I've got one question and one. Two questions. We'll see whether one's appropriate for now. The first really is about the very last point you mentioned about connections with the Ealing Parent Carer Forum, etc.
Yeah.
One of the hats I'm wearing today is as a representative of the Ealing Community Network, which is the borough's largest network of voluntary sector organisations, and many of them work with children, both primary and secondary school ages.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it might be really helpful for them if they were able in some way to connect with this conversation, because I think one of the interesting comments made earlier, and I can't recall who made it, was that one of the good things about that came through COVID was a great collaboration between schools, but there was also great collaboration between schools and the wider community. Mm-hmm. And I think this is an opportunity to continue that. Yeah. So I think it'd be helpful if we could have a chat afterwards, perhaps, about attending a meeting of the network and introducing you to people and therefore parents from a wide spectrum of backgrounds across the borough.
That would be absolutely fantastic. Yeah, please.
Yeah, that's my first. My second one, I don't know if it'd be appropriate now, but I had a question about food poverty and how this impacts on children. Would that be more appropriate later in the agenda?
Well, we've got the next bits are around the Southall Resilience Project and the No Learner Left Behind project. So you could either leave it to the end, maybe, or you can mention it now. It's however I don't.
Fine, I'll wait till then. It's no problem. Thank you.
Can I ask the question, please?
Yes, Councillor Mann.
Yeah, just hold on. Yeah. Thank you, Madhu. Very helpful presentation. My question is the proportion of young people not in training and employment, NEET and SEN, remains low in relation to London, but disproportion impact can be seen in the rise of NEET in Acton and Southall to 2019 and 21. The long-term forecast of the effect of the pandemic on inequalities look bleak. How supportive has Ealing Council can do more in learning partnership between the COVID pandemic?
Okay, yeah. So actually, some of the work that Samira and Sarah are going to share actually will touch on that in terms of making supporting the sort of the children to have a better experience, I suppose. But there's a couple of things there. So one is around the Careers Leaders Network and the Post-16 Leaders Network. So it's an agenda item in those networks and is being addressed through those networks. It's a beginning of a conversation. We've set up the hub, so that will support, and that's working with Spring Hallow School. We've also got a Progression and Pathways Committee that Julie mentioned right at the beginning. So that committee is focused on this work and actions, and if it's helpful, we can always share the action plan. I don't know if that's helpful. I haven't got it with me to hand now, but if that is helpful, we can share that with you.
Yeah, and just to support Madhu, we were also very much linked with Ealing Skills and Employment team and their youth offer. So they've been working very hard to create to make sure that all of our 16, 17, 18-year-olds are in employment, education and training. So there's quite a rich youth offer coming out for our learners as well.
And Councillor Mann, in terms of how the council can support, obviously a lot of our children haven't been able to have access to work experience because employers haven't been able to offer that. So, you know, that's somewhere where I think we need to start seeing if employers will start being willing to have work experience students back in. I think that would really help as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Malcolm.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I've got some questions, Madhu, relating to mental health, and I can see there are some details in some of the recommendations, which is encouraging to see. But my first question goes to the report where in Appendix 2, I think it is, it doesn't break down the sort of the rates, if you will, of those with mental health, either before COVID or during, in terms of by geography or different ethnicities or different subsections within the community. And I think that might be helpful just to give a sort of a flavour of that. And then sort of leading on from that, there is quite a, I think it's paragraph 6, where you've got 6.1 to 6.5, page 45 of the recommendations, which I think is encouraging to see there is some thought and planning as to how you can avoid problems in the future or reduce problems that you're now seeing. But how will these recommendations target groups, whether it's by geography, ethnicity, or any subgroup of the overall population, to sort of reduce those problems moving forwards? And then what do you expect to see with regard to mental health in 12 months' time if you follow some of these processes, and how long will it take for any of these processes to be changed or implemented?
Okay, that's quite a lot there, really. And with the Scrutiny 2 panel, the whole mental health agenda was covered there by the mental health team. So I don't know, again, if it's helpful for us to share the report from the Scrutiny 2 panel with you, because actually all the areas you mentioned there, Councillor Malcolm, in terms of the more detail and sort of going underneath it is all in that report. Is that possible? I mean, I don't know if that's something that we can do.
Yeah, I think the slides that you're referring to is the Joint Strategic Needs Analysis that's conducted by Public Health, and the work that's pulled out of that analysis informs the Council's Children and Young People's Plan, where the focus is very much on mental health and school readiness, and very much around SEN as well. So I think I'm not sure Madhu would be able to answer that question in a comprehensive way, but certainly that Scrutiny 2 report is very comprehensive on the Council's mental health and wellbeing support services for children and young people. So yes, I would refer you to that paper.
Thanks for that, Julie and Madhu. And yeah, I am conscious that Scrutiny panel is looking at that, and looking at inequalities. I think well-being, mental health is a big part of that. But actually, especially from the last meeting, we saw actually how many interdependent multitude of kind of causes and effects there are, and so we don't want to double up the work there. So if you don't mind, Gary could refer to the work the other panel are doing. So do I have any more questions for Madhu, or can we continue? No more hands up. Okay, great.
Lovely, thank you. So now we want to shine a light on some of the work that we've been doing to support our vulnerable groups as part of the wider recovery response, really. And we began the No Learner Left Behind project before COVID, but actually lockdown and the whole experience has really created an appetite and momentum in schools to do things differently, to reflect on their practice. And so Samira is going to share the details of the programme and also our race equity work with you.
Actually, Madhu, I'm going to start.
You can start.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the No Learner Left Behind project, and then Samira's going to talk about the Wi-Fi secretary work. And can you put the slides back up, please? Thank you. Hi, everybody. So my name's Sarah Thompson. I'm the Vulnerable Groups and School Partnerships Lead within the Ealing Learning Partnership, and my colleague Samira John Bailey is an early years consultant within Ealing, and we've jointly been leading the No Learner Left Behind project, and we jointly led on the race equity work in schools and early years settings that started last year. So I'm just going to touch on the No Learner Left Behind project, which, as Madhu said, was something that we started prior to the pandemic. But I think it's important because we know the pandemic exacerbated the inequalities. I think that's why we've included it within this report, and why it's so important that we continue this work even further. So in terms of the project, so it started actually back in October 2019, and really it was the focus on Black Caribbean pupil achievement, and it was as a result of persistent and entrenched underachievement for Black Caribbean pupils that has happened within Ealing and across London and nationally for many years. And this project was our attempt to do something different, and to really try to, I think, as you can see on the slide, the aim was to deepen our collective understanding of the underachievement of our Black Caribbean pupils in Ealing, and really start to think about what our framework for action was going to be. So we started small. We had an initial pilot project where we wanted it to be cross-phase. So it started from nursery all the way through to high schools. We got settings and schools to nominate themselves. So we had 13 within the first cohort. And a central part of the project was around seeing parents as equal partners and community organisations, and recognising that along with schools and early years settings, we were all trying to achieve the same thing. We wanted the very best for our Black Caribbean children, and how could we work collectively to achieve that? A key part of the programme, so the programme was designed to last for 1.5 years, but because of the pandemic, there was obviously we lost momentum in the middle, but I think we regained it once we learned how to do a lot of the things online. So we were able to offer some really high quality training around things like unconscious bias, racial identity theory, really looking at how to challenge disproportionality, and starting to look at things like the curriculum and how that was represented for children. We did have some key learning. We aren't able to say the project has had a direct impact on the outcomes of children and young people, and we always knew this would be much longer term, but I think there's been key learning that we have used to feed into the cohort 2, which has just started. The launch event was a couple of weeks ago, and we've got 23 early years settings schools taking part as part of cohort 2, along with cohort 1 who are continuing. And so the key learning was around the importance of high quality training, and how essential it is, because everybody has different lived experiences, and it's really important to ensure that all the staff that are involved in the education of Black Caribbean pupils have a shared understanding of the challenges, and the idea that everybody can move forward together. So that was absolutely key, and that's something that we have brought in right at the very beginning of this second cohort of schools and settings. The importance of the positive representation of Black Caribbean people and culture across the curriculum and the school, and the strength of feeling for the young people themselves and for their parents about how important that is. Another key then that we said was about the importance of parents, and we now have a Black Caribbean Parents Forum in Ealing that we started as part of the project, but is now being led by parents, and Samira and I are part of that, but we're not leading it any longer, and we hope that over time that will grow and grow, so that there is this group of parents who are able to provide support for each other, and also to work with alongside schools and early years settings. And the thing we've also learned is there are lots of difficult topics that to do this work well, you have to be able to have open and honest and uncomfortable conversations. And we've spent a lot of time, I think, through the training, supporting people to be able to do that, and we're still at the very beginning, and we've got plans to extend that, but it's absolutely crucial that everybody's able to have be able to talk about race and identity in a way that sometimes is not easy, and just recognizing that there isn't a quick fix. The underachievement of our Black Caribbean pupils has been ongoing for many years, and we aren't going to transform it overnight. And really recognizing, trying to think about how we transform the sort of the policy and practice within early years settings in schools, so that it's not dependent on whoever's in charge. It's within, the changes are sort of sewn into the fabrics of the organisations, and so that's something that's not something that can happen quickly overnight. So that's what we've been doing around the No Learn Left Behind project. And then, because we were working on this project, and when the death of George Floyd and then the Black Lives Matters protests, that then, as Julie and Madhu said, created a much greater awareness and interest in this area. And Samira is now going to talk about what that led us on to in terms of our race equity programme. So I'm going to pass over to Samira now.
Thank you, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. Thank you. So the aims of the Race Equity Programme were to raise awareness of the issues relating to unconscious bias, racial identity and disproportionality experienced, and also to provide opportunities for colleagues to gain, not just colleagues actually, I'll share that in a moment, to gain essential knowledge in relation to Black history across the world and the contributions that Black people have made as well, but also to begin to really critically evaluate practice and curriculum to inform the policies and procedures and practices that takes place within our schools and early years settings as well. So the training programme really offered to those schools and colleagues and organisations who weren't necessarily a part of the No Learner Left Behind programme. So it was open up to a broader range of colleagues. And we've been meeting the aims of the Race Equity programme through the delivery of training. And that's training for our teaching staff and non-teaching staff within schools, also including our governors and childminders and other early years settings. For our local authority colleagues, so colleagues within children and families, the children's services, were able to attend the training as well. We also opened up to community organisations, some of whom we partner with through the No Learner Left Behind project, and others were new to working with us. We also wanted to ensure, and part of the an extension from the No Learner Left Behind project is about ensuring that our parents and young people, children and young people, are at the heart of what we do as well. So we've commissioned training in terms of Black history, which has been led for our children and young people and parents to attend at the same time. And it's been open to parents of all ethnicities, as well as a subgroup, which were for our Black Caribbean parents as well and young people. We've the Race Equity programme offer has been also led through our leader network meetings for our early years colleagues, and through working parties with involving early years specialists as well. And at the end of April, in April 21, we conducted an online survey just to gain a sense of what the interim progress of this Race Equity programme had been, and received 69 respondents. And the greatest impact reported by our colleagues, and the respondents included parents, governors, social care staff, schools and earlier settings, so a range of people. And the greatest impact that people reported as a result of the Race Equity training programme was about the fact that they felt enabled to engage in open and honest conversations pertaining to race and ethnicity and racial disparities, which was really heartening, because as Sarah said, it can feel uncomfortable, and if we can begin to have those uncomfortable conversations, but open and honest conversations, we can then continue having those conversations pertaining to our children within our schools and settings, and to have those deeper level conversations as well. Thank you. The next slide, please. Thank you. So as Sarah said, we've rolled out the No Learner Left Behind programme to our second cohort for our early years schools and settings, and we're really pleased with the increase in numbers of schools and settings who've engaged in the process. And we are in the process of developing an Ealing race equality handbook for early years schools and settings as well. And aside to that, we're working on a document which is pertaining specifically to race equality in the early years and what does that look like. We also have a program of annual program of training in terms of race equity for our early years staff, our school staff and governors. And we are also keen to ensure that for our schools and settings who are part of the No Learner Left Behind project, they are receiving whole school training, but we also want to ensure that if there are new colleagues joining those schools in future years, that those new colleagues can also be trained and receive the training through the annual race equity training programme as well. And alongside that, we have our continued race equity network meetings. So a whole raft of training and support to our schools and settings. So thank you. That's our update in terms of.
Yeah. I think there was one. Sorry, Samira, to talk over you. There was one more slide, Madhu.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Councillor Block, is it okay if we just go on to the next slide and then we do questions all together? So this is just another project, a new project that we wanted to highlight to you that we've begun. It's sort of which aims to support the Southall community, who we know have been disproportionately affected and impacted by COVID. So Sarah's just going to share that information with you, and then that's it from us, and we'll take questions and any feedback.
Thanks, Madhu. Thank you. Yes, as Madhu said, so this project really came about in response to all of the information we were receiving from schools, but also from other services about the disproportionate impact of COVID on schools on the Southall community. And from the work that we were already doing within Southall, I've got someone in my team who works on the Dongles Wells Opportunity Network with a small group of schools, and we were very aware of the challenges that schools were facing and the whole range of different services and support they were providing to families. So the aim of this, initially short term, but potentially it may grow over time into a longer term project, but was to really try to support schools to address the social, educational, health and the financial impacts of COVID on their pupils and families. And it's really about providing some additional coordination support so that to help schools in Southall to work together in effective partnerships with local services, and brokering that access to services as well. We're aware, as everybody is trying to help communities recover from COVID, a lot of the time services, they try to go in through schools because obviously they have the relationship with families, and it's trying to make sense of that and coordinate that with and on behalf of schools, as well as offering training where they felt their staff needed it, because schools are being asked for advice on areas that are way outside of their expertise. So it's whether it's upskilling the staff, but also knowing how to refer families on to other organisations, particularly the voluntary sector. So there's a whole area of work on that. There's also an area of work around creating a network of parent welcomers or ambassadors across Southall. So ideally that schools have these roles who can then connect with the parents and support parents and schools and the communication. And we're working with John Lyons on an initial pilot project, so we're hoping to get some more resources into Southall for that. And it's and just a lot around trying to engage families with the opportunities that are out there. So trying to work with things that happen, say, through Let's Go Southall, and just trying to connect families, so who have obviously, as we all have had to be more insular, trying to re-engage them. So we have somebody that's working across the schools in Southall to try to achieve that. So yeah, I think that was all I was going to say. Thank you.
Okay, that's it from us.
Great, thank you so much. Right, I'm going to open up for questions. I can see a few hands up. I'll go to Councillor Koopma first.
Thank you, and thank you all for a really comprehensive feedback, and I think half my questions have been answered. But what I wanted to know was the approach or the future plans that your trainings and everything that you're doing, is that based upon responses from what you've put out there, or what is the feedback from parents and local community groups? It'd be interesting to know how you've based your training projects out there. So
thank you, Sarah. Is that pertain to Southall? Is that pertain to the Southall project, or is that the No Learn Left Behind project?
Both.
Okay, so
go on, Sarah.
Should I start off there with some of the No Learn Left Behind, and then we can add on as well. So yes, the plans. Because of the fact that we've tried to ensure that for the No Learner Left Behind project, that we are having our parents and our young people and our communities are also at the heart of the project as well. We have been receiving feedback from parents, and from the very beginning as well, including from the Black Caribbean Parents Forum, and their feedback has helped to shape the work that we're doing, which we share with schools, but also supports us with our direction of travel in terms of working collaboratively, parents and schools working collaboratively together, and community organisations, not necessarily, beyond the lifespan of the project, beyond the lifespan of the programme. So really think about that long-term sustainability, that they are working together, and that has been based on the feedback as well from schools and community organisations and our parents, because they all have those common aims and goals. So that's an initial response. Sarah and Madhu?
Thank you. In terms of the Southall resilience, we've did an initial survey with the schools to ask them what they felt was the areas they would need the most support in. And in terms of training, things came up around things like immigration, that schools get asked quite a lot about that, and not that they're going to become immigration experts, but just have a basic understanding so that they sort of know the framework that families are having to operate within. And so that's something that it will be dependent on what schools are telling us, but also what the organisation we can signpost to, because there are specialists out there. So it's making sure that schools know who they are so that they can refer families on.
And also, I think just to say, through all our networks, while the pandemic was happening, we had lots of conversations with schools, and so we were all starting to hear the threads then of where the worries were and where the concerns were. And so special needs coordinators, when I met with them, I was hearing one picture, and then the safeguarding team, when they were talking to designated safeguarding leads, they were hearing it. And so when we all came together, it was like, oh, actually, we're hearing these concerns from all these different areas. Let's come together and see what we can do. And then it kind of escalated to where we are now. So yeah, so responding to very much to schools and what we're hearing.
But the schools, when you say schools and responding to what, their feedback obviously comes from the parents and the experiences that they're experiences that are incurring in their school, in their schools. Is that how, I was just interested to know how that information is collated and what is a priority in putting a program together. And then making it a success, because if parents and local community groups are part of it and you're listening to them, are we really listening to everything they're saying? And then it comes together, and then you come up with your training programs and you put action into plans
into place. Yeah,
received.
Yeah, and I think the No Learn Left Behind project is really been a good example and a good model of that, with the, you know, having the parent forum they're involved and I think learning from pupils and parents and the schools and bringing all that information together. So it's a really good model then, that now with the Southall project that we can then, that we're learning from, and then we'll see. And this is right at the beginning stages, it really is. So this is, you know, we're not at a place to share impact, but the one impact I think we can share, one is that we know what the needs are of the schools now and parents, because they've shared that with us, but also the links that we've made with other with services and volunteer sectors is amazing. And now with JAMPAL involved, we'll be able to link even more. So I think that is already a success of this. And I think, as Samira said, it's the longevity of it. You know, we want to set things up so that we can walk away and it carries on. You know, that will be the success, won't it, really? And we won't see that right now. Hopefully in a few years' time, we'll be reporting back to you on that.
Thank you.
Mr. Bazran.
Thank you, Chair. I've got three things. Firstly, Sarah, in terms of Southall resilience, you mentioned links with local voluntary groups. Well, we're an umbrella organisation set up as a network of local voluntary groups in Southall. So if you like to have a chat afterwards, happy to connect you with groups providing advice, all sorts of activity sessions, arts, crafts, you name it, the whole spectrum.
So brilliant.
We've got lots.
Yeah, I mean, the person in my team may well have already had contact with you, but definitely, because I think we've connected with the Young Ealing Foundation, who obviously work with a certain group of community organisations, but I know that yours would be wider than that. Yeah, so that'd be brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Secondly, I had a question for Samira, which was around our schools in Southall particularly teaching about local history, the local history of anti-racist experience, because we're actually we're visiting a couple of schools and actually engaging with school children about the sort of anti-racist past of Southall, which covers all sorts of issues, from the simplistic, respect and tolerance for younger children, to issues around sort of segregation, busing, Blair Peach, 1979, all sorts. So does the teaching you're talking about cover local history? And my final question, because I know there'll be many others from colleagues, was around food poverty. This is something which really worries me. Last year, in the thick of the pandemic, we, along with many partners, including Young Ealing Foundation, set up a food bank in Southall. Yeah. And we were shocked at just how many families with particularly small children were being referred to us by 6 schools in dire need of emergency food help. And the sad thing is that actually some of those families are still with us. That's the first thing. But some of our partners, who include the Akshay Patra Foundation and Southall Lions Club, are still providing food even now for breakfast clubs and for children at certain primary schools. I won't name them. And I was just, it's heartbreaking to hear that, there are these problems and that children are not being fed properly. Of course, if you're not fed, you can't think, you can't work. The rest of the jigsaw doesn't work at all in terms of education. So
we've lost you.
Way, but it will require a collective long-term solution. So again, that's just a sort of an offer stroke question for yourselves. Thanks.
Thank you, thank you, Jampal. If I can just respond to your question about local history in Southall and our schools, our children in receiving that local history. So two aspects. It's a two-pronged approach to your question, two-pronged answer. So the first part is that the No Learner Left Behind Black Housing Achievement Project, we're viewing that very much as a launch pad for anti-racist education and practice within our schools and early years settings, and a chance for schools and settings to engage in a deep dive into and deep reflection in terms of our practice for one group of learners that we can then translate to other groups of learners as well. But alongside the project, there is a training provider who we have commissioned to deliver Black History training. The training provider who we've commissioned to deliver the Black History training for our parents, children and young people, she's also, some schools have also commissioned her to deliver training for their schools, and part of that, particularly in Southall schools, does include the anti-racist work and activism of Southall, and all the work, the rich history beyond that as well within Southall as well. So there is work taking place within our schools and settings, not necessarily directly as part of the Black Caribbean Achievement Project yet, but that there is support and information being provided to our schools. Thank you.
And just in response to your point you made about the food banks, I think, I mean, there were many schools before the pandemic who had links with organisations like the Felix Project, and they were already handing out food parcels essentially on a regular basis, probably to a smaller group of families. I think the interesting thing about the pandemic, it seems to be, because everybody was in the same situation, we were all struggling, more people were perhaps willing to come forward and say that they needed help. But also obviously in Southall there's so many people whose jobs were connected to the airport and those sorts of things, so that's going to take a long time to recover. One thing we're trying to do as part of the Southall Resilience Project, and we've started that, is to connect with the employment and skills team within the council, who also, as Judy said, they've got a youth offer, they've got a big programme, so we're trying to connect with them and make that link with schools. I mean, that's a longer term strategy in terms of supporting families so that they are able to access employment and not have to rely on the food banks. But I think you're absolutely right, we're hearing that still, that there's so many families that are still relying on food projects and food banks. So yeah, we would totally support that.
And actually many school staff, lots of teachers are you know, I'm a governor in a school, and I often will deliver food, you know, give food. It's still, I agree with you, it's heartbreaking, it really is. I think lots of schools are doing it themselves, actually, very much so, and supporting those families. I agree. There's something that we are doing, Sarah, I think we can probably share. We have had a bid approved very recently, literally yesterday, where we're going to for ESOL classes, but with the ESOL class, so English classes, but digital literacy to be part of that. So I think that will hopefully help to gain help some families in terms of their confidence, being able to communicate, which hopefully might help with some securing jobs, perhaps. You know, that again is long term, but there is something there around hopefully helping families to be a bit more secure financially, maybe, which will help. I mean,
yeah. Can I just say that there's actually, Sarah, something called a Southall Jobs Partnership, which has been set up by colleagues from the council's regeneration team. So
okay.
We again, I think it'd be really good to have a representative there. From yourself, like yourselves, or from schools, and they have a lot of the big employment providers as well as local, local developers and so on, and voluntary sector on there, and we meet kind of roughly quarterly. So I think that would be a good
that
opportunity.
Would be really good. Yeah, for the progression team.
Yeah, and then perhaps the progressions and pathways team, or you know, the careers leads or careers leads. Yeah, definitely, we can definitely make some links there. That'd be amazing.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just come in just to respond to Councillor Mann's earlier query regarding those young people who aren't not in education, employment or training, and we did say that we would address it. So I just want to come back to that. As part of the Race Equity Training Programme, one of the things that we really try to do is foster collaboration between attendees, regardless whether they're from schools, community organisations and so forth, and local authority colleagues. And one of those collaborative partnerships that really helped to forge and foster were between the local Ealing College, and colleagues within the youth justice team, who were really both parties independently of each other. Their aims were looking at reducing the number of children not sorry, not children, young people not in education, employment or training. And so that's a partnership that has been established, and those colleagues are meeting regularly to explore ways in which they can address that within their own individual organisations, but also collectively as well. So just wanted to respond to your query, Councillor Mann.
Thank you, Samira. Do I have any other members who'd like to ask any questions? No. Well, I just wanted to ask about the kind of focus on unconscious bias in terms of the no learners left behind, and especially, if you look at students being expelled from school or sanctioned, it's, it disproportionately does affect Black boys especially. And so getting that within, from leadership all the way down to ground staff, asking themselves why this is happening. Is it just about the student, or is it, I think that's really important work. And I think that, one of the things that I think is really important is what you're talking about, like once that it's this long-term work, but it's embedded, and it's that kind of systemic racism that, we've known about since, Stephen Lawrence and that report many years ago, and it still feels like we haven't really made that, we can start getting that in. So when you go away, or perhaps a certain head teacher's not there, it continues. Because my experience is that at the moment, the schools I'm aware of, there's really different levels of engagement and the messaging and behavior. We've had the Black Lives Matter, and we saw this summer the way that Marcus Rashford, Saka, etc. were treated after young people. And actually it was really emotional for a lot of the community and for people. It wasn't just about inequality, or it was visceral. And some of the schools have reacted really well to that, aware of how it affects their community. Their students are wanting to hold a lot of the people who stood up to criticism and been brave as role models. Some schools have been completely quiet, haven't said anything about it. And so really embedding that kind of unconscious bias training, and embedding, how it's part of every single school, because I feel the schools that are engaging in the ELP and no learners left behind are probably ahead. And how do we get all the schools up, to scratch? And that it's not, perhaps in more central Ealing, where you have got less of a kind of BME community, and less inequality, that those head teachers don't think that it's important for them, or I don't want to pick on schools and names, but it doesn't seem very consistent. And how these programs will really try to accelerate that through all our schools. And is it also engaging with the Race Equality Commission that is ongoing at the moment as well, to make sure that we've got really tied up across the council to get that into our schools and communities.
Can I just, if I can just begin then? So I think you're absolutely right. There are, and some individuals and also organisations, including our schools, who, as a result of the training that we've offered, there'll be a greater degree of confidence throughout the senior leadership teams, but also throughout the rest of the school staff as well. And I think that may then increase how vocal they are, because you talked about quiet schools and those who are more vocal, and just the fact that the high quality training that our schools and settings are receiving really has aided that. And the other element is that what we are really keen to promote is that schools and settings are systematically reviewing their policies as well, so it's not so that we are ensuring that beyond the tenure of that particular head teacher, that those processes and policies and practices can still be implemented. And the other thing, you talked about Marcus Rashford and Bukayo Saka and the other footballers. And as a result of that, what we've tried to do and try to support some of our leaders with is really thinking about compassionate leadership, and really thinking about how do we respond to our communities in times where there are key elements, key high-profile issues pertaining to race, for example, in the media, how do we respond and support our whole school communities with that in a compassionate way, but also in a manageable way as well? So just wanted to respond to that, to what you've mentioned. Thank you. I've lost my train of thought. Apologies.
Thanks. Thanks, Amira. Yeah, just just saying that I really think that it needs to be pushed to all schools and get that consistent awareness and practice within all our schools in Ealing.
That's right. That's the point I wanted to get to. So in terms of all our schools, the project has been a voluntary, schools are opting into the process. But what is happening is, as a result of that, and a result of the race equity training program as well, a greater number of schools are opting in, and we are anticipating that as time goes on, those numbers will increase as well. And oh gosh, I've lost my train. I'm so sorry. So yes, we are anticipating that as time goes on, a greater number of colleagues and schools will be participating, and we'll continue to promote that. And the final thing I wanted to say is that we have been really trying to raise the awareness within our schools and early year settings that the numbers of Black Caribbean children within each school or setting can be quite small, and schools may initially think that, may overlook those smaller groups of children, and may not necessarily feel that a project such as this is relevant to themselves. But there are many schools and settings involved in the project with small numbers, and are seeing the relevance for those small people numbers, but also for the rest of the whole school community as well.
Because I think it's really important that it's within all schools, no matter the demographic, because actually we're all part of society, and if they are schools with less BME cohorts, those white students aren't aware of the issues happening in their communities, but just a little bit away. They're not growing up to think, how am I going to be part of the solution? So anyway, I see there's a few hands up. Julie, I'll go to you.
Well, I just wanted to say that, the message that we want to get out loud and clear is that if you want to be a leader in Ealing, then you need to be a leader for race equality, and you need to address your own gaps in your knowledge and your understanding and your own confidence in tackling inequality, because as you quite rightly say, you cannot possibly be an educational leader in Ealing, in London, and not be confident in this area. So we're absolutely committed to making, telling our schools, that is what we expect, and aligned with that, we have to also accept that there's a lot of training and development needed, and we need to also work with governors on recruitment and the kind of questions and selection activities that are used in recruitment to leadership positions. So it's a huge piece of work, but I absolutely agree that we need to make our expectations clear.
Thanks, Julie. I see Councillor Kumar and Mr. Barrister still have their hands up. Are these new questions or?
Okay.
Sorry, I'll go to Councillor Kumar.
Okay. Julie, thank you for the response you've given and about the strong messaging, because I think that is very much needed. I wanted to know, what sort of response are you getting from schools down Acton, that end of the borough, especially East Acton?
I haven't got the list of schools in front of me, so I couldn't off the top of my head say who's in cohort 1 or cohort 2, but we can certainly look into whether there are any particular parts of the borough that we don't feel have sort of put them, have engaged in any of the training. I think, Samira and Sarah have tried to manage this very sensitively, and not, we don't want to at this point sort of point the finger at schools that have not engaged. We want to make such a compelling case through the quality of the work that Samira and Sarah are leading, and the experience of those people involved in it. Why wouldn't you do it? And at the moment, we're really clear that what we want to do is make a convincing and compelling case, and recognise that there will be some people who are less confident in coming forward than others, but by next year, by cohort 3, hopefully we'll have everybody, and it's kind of getting that balance right between setting an expectation and addressing that some of the deep fear and anxiety that leaders have in putting themselves forward and making themselves vulnerable. So we've got to try and tread that line and get it right, really.
Okay, so if I can just add as well, there are a few heads who had expressed an interest in participating this for cohort 2, but then there were capacity issues where they decided that actually they needed to wait and postpone their participation until next academic year. So there are some. So for those who aren't participating, there's a willingness, but they're also mindful of COVID, the impact of COVID on staff and on their capacity to take on board a quite intensive project, which this is, program, alongside other recovery measures that for some schools and settings are really heavily steeped in. So there is a willingness with some of those who aren't yet involved. I just think it's important to state that.
Okay, because it is important that those that are not so willing to come forward are on your radar, and I can, I understand from what you all said that work is ongoing, but you are on top of that, are you? I mean, it is part of your priority as well.
Absolutely, as Julie said, we know which schools are involved in cohort 1 and cohort 2, and we know, that we will be continuing to push and market to promote the program, so that as many and all of our the ultimate aim is that all of our early years schools and settings are accessing and have participated within the program, to ensure that there's a level playing field across all of our educational settings, and expectations and understanding, a shared understanding across our local authority. That's the ultimate aim.
Okay, and the 480 or around that figure that participated, was that from a particular end of the borough, or was it in a different area? What was the percentage of participation?
So I in terms of the participation, that was definitely across the borough, and there were no particular parts of the borough that weren't represented. And also, as a result of colleagues attending and schools attending the wider race equity programme, many of them decided that they wanted to participate in cohort 2. To enable that their whole staff teams can attend that training as well. So we haven't necessarily seen a disparity in terms of the different localities within the borough. We haven't noticed that there is participation across the board, including schools in Acton as well.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
And I think Mr. Bazran had a question.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just on the point you raised about disparities and so on, again, I repeat that Ealing and particular parts of Ealing have got a very rich history, which I think our local school curriculums ignore. Only now, I think, is there a kind of a glimmer of interest being shown in what's happened in our locality. So more often than not, our school children will learn about sort of Henry VIII and medieval history and Queen Victoria and so on, but they won't know what happened 40 years ago, or the troubles and racism that their parents experienced, or what their grandparents encountered when they came over, or Windrush and all this sorts of things. So I think that there's a real need to get local, to talk to local voluntary groups, encourage the teaching of local history at a very, very basic level. And I think that will start creating a different perception within the minds of our Black kids, create positive role models, which I think are really urgently needed, and help to try and make equalities a mainstream issue, not something that's a sort of a side byproduct, if you like. I mean, someone mentioned Stephen Lawrence. How many people know that Stephen Lawrence's mother, Doreen, was actually a volunteer in Southall for the monitoring group after her son was killed? People don't know these things, but there's this and a million other facts. But I'd say, let's get local, let's teach local history, let's change the curriculum. That's what I would urge. Thanks.
If I could just quickly respond to that. As part of the No Learn Left Behind project, we are planning in the early part of next year, we're planning some curriculum sessions for the schools that are taking part, and we're still formulating those. And I think that's definitely something we can think about, how we include that and enhance that. Absolutely. So, and if you have any suggestions as to organisations or people that we could connect with, and that would be really good as well. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Thanks. We'll be in touch, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, my understanding of this as a governor is that some schools are already engaging with that. So when the whole Black Lives Matter happened last summer, they were sending out materials to their students, but then thinking beyond that and thinking, actually, it's not just about 1 month or one event, and how do we start embedding it through. And I think perhaps this is one of the recommendations we can I'd like to suggest, is that actually taking that further to all schools to look within their curriculum, because I think as much as we'd love it, a lot of schools' hands are tied by the national curriculum and also what they have to deliver. But if schools can be more kind of ambitious about how they deliver that and embedding those ideas of equality and our Black role models who are, as Jampa will say, within our own communities, right on our doorsteps. So do I have any more questions from members? I don't see any hands up. Right. Well, I'd like to really say a huge thank you to Julie, Samira, Sarah and Madhu for that really informative presentation, for taking the time to answer all our questions. I think it's been a really interesting panel. I think that recent events have really shone a light to all of these inequalities, and I think children have, I think, really suffered from the pandemic. I think when you sometimes think about the hundreds of years it took to get almost every child in the world into school, and we hadn't quite managed that, and then with a blink of an eye almost every child across the globe wasn't in school. It's quite powerful, and it's really good to know that the council's keeping an eye on how we work in that recovery and ensure that those gaps are met, and the well-being of staff and children are forefront of that recovery. Harjeet, in terms of going forward with this item, I think there were a couple of suggestions from the panel. Mr. Bazran, talk about the embedding local history into the curriculum in terms of No Learning Left Behind and our Black community. I think Councillor Byrne made a very good suggestion about really thinking about how we ensure going future that infrastructure and internet access isn't going to be a block for children's learning. And I think that one of the things that we talk about today is that actually some good has come out of it, that some schools are going forward with blending some of that tech into their learning, but that then brings up that problem again if some children don't have access to the internet and infrastructure. So if I open it to members what it is that we want to suggest there. Do we want to go for a very ambitious suggestion that the council works towards having a co-op broadband offer to all our residents, or do we want to look at something less ambitious and suggest that there's a kind of investment into dongles and identifying those students who have access issues? So I'm going to open that up to members of what our suggestion should be.
I think, Chair, you should be bold.
I should be bold.
Be bold wherever possible, and also I think in the spirit of hosting a race equality commission in Ealing for the first time, I think we should take really strong kind of actions or make recommendations. We could look at the resourcing and the afterwards, but fear about lack of resourcing shouldn't hold us back in making the right suggestions now. Really is how I feel about it.
Thank you, Dr. Izen.
I think the idea of something cooperative to provide IT for everybody is a wonderful idea, but I don't know that we're the sort of people that would have the expertise to necessarily recommend. And there are people who study such things, and maybe it's time to get advice from people who know about IT systems in the social context, but I do think it's a very powerful idea. So maybe rather than recommend something at the moment, you could put forward some information to whoever you report to say, this is what we are considering, and we will take advice on the matter.
Anybody else with, yes, Councillor Byrne.
Yeah, just to say, I mean, the role of recommendations is to say, this is what we think is a good idea. Now, how it goes forward is up to the officers and ultimately the Overview and Scrutiny Committee as well. So I think, yes, we can say, look, we think that there's a potential need for having some kind of cheap or relatively easy access to broadband across the borough that could be potentially done through a cooperative. Why don't we make that, a suggestion that they can investigate it? Yeah. So that you can phrase the recommendation like that, but I think it is a case that you need to actually plant the idea within the officers. If you just say, well, what do we think? Then the officers will say, we don't think anything. But, no offence to the officers who are online, but I'm 14 years of being a councillor. You learn. So I think, maybe this is an opportunity to just say, look, we recommend this. Why don't we go away and investigate? And that potentially could be a scrutiny panel next year. Who knows? That's right, the attitude to take.
Well, thank you, Councillor Byrne, and thank you everybody for your suggestions. I think that it is a really, important for, we saw how kind of that move to remote learning, remote working, and that infrastructure was such a barrier for families. So, there was that drive to get devices out, but not necessarily then still the access. So we'll go with the suggestion that this is looked into, the infrastructure is looked into, and that our suggestion would be that the council looks into ensuring that there is free / cheap broadband available to all residents of the borough, to ensure that that's not a barrier for our children. Right, it's been a long meeting, so I'm trying to go back and think, were there any other suggestions or recommendations during the discussions? Rajit, if you could help me.
I think you've captured them.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. Oh, okay. Well, once again, thank you so much to the officers. I know you put a lot of work into the report, and it was very comprehensive and really informative, and it was really good to see that a lot of good work is going in, and I know that a lot of this will be long term. I think the effects of the pandemic on our children sadly isn't going to be an easy fix, and it's great that there's so much cooperative work going on to try to get ahead of that. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
I think we are now onto the works programme, which I hope that everyone agrees with. I didn't see anything glaringly difficult there. So if we agree the works programme, I'm going to take silence to mean agreement. We can then go on to the date of the next meeting, which is going to be the 10th of
February.
Yeah. So that concludes our meeting. Thank you so much, everyone, for your contributions today, and I hope you can enjoy the rest of your evening now. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.